Gettysburg Seminary presents the Seminary Explores podcast. Conversations on faith, art, people, politics, theology, life, and more, with voices from around the corner and around the globe.
Good day. Welcome to the Seminary Explorers. My name is Nelson Strobert, and my guests today for the Seminary Explorers are retired associate professor of church administration and practice from the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia, and Dr. Joseph Donnella, chaplain of the college and adjunct professor in religious studies at Gettysburg College. Welcome to the Seminary Explorers.
Thank you.
Today, one of the concerns that I've had, and that many people have had concerns with over the past couple of years, has been the whole issue of Black Lives Matter. And I'd like to focus our conversation today on this whole phenomenon that has taken place. When you hear the terms Black Lives Matter, what comes to mind for each of you?
Well, to start off with, it says very clearly, you're looking at me. The one thing you didn't say in the announcement is that all three of us are in the academic profession. We're also all African Americans or African descent. And so in one sense, we're talking about not only me, but my children and my grandchildren. Because we're all elders in the church at this point, too. So for me professionally, it's been a really tough couple of years to both read about what's happening in varying places around the country, but at the same time, it also says very clearly there are some lessons I've got to make sure that I've been giving to my grandchildren and to make sure that my children are passing on to their children.
Okay. Joseph?
When I first heard the term, I was struck by it. And for a couple of reasons. First, I thought, well, it's a very simple and direct way of talking about the fact that there's still the phenomena in this country of avoidance and sort of not looking at what happens to the lives of in this case, it was largely black men and black women, but the focus was about violence against black men and their treatment in situations where many would not have thought that there might be the escalation of violence or racism or anything, but it was clearly for me, a reminder that what we had been talking about in the past is still present in our world today.
So what you're saying is that in some ways the term Black Lives Matter, I mean, it has always been an issue. What do you think has caused it to come to this point of conversation and concern or publicity?
Well, I think in many ways, we thought, kind of growing up in the 50s and the 60s, and in college for most of us in the 60s, 70s, we thought it was over. We thought that we had gotten through there. I was in grade school when Brown versus the school board was a court decision. I was in college during most of the civil rights movement. We were able to change the ways and that people behaved because of laws. But we did not do an effective job of saying very clearly that people's attitudes needed to change as well about who we were and what we were to be a part of. So that in many ways, I would say that there has never been a year that I have not had something happen to me that I could interpret, and that's always in question, well, you're interpreting it that way, but I didn't interpret it that way, as being some kind of poking at me as a person of color and not necessarily a person of means or of intelligence or of character or of anything else. It has just been because of the color of my skin.
And I would add, I'm a little bit younger, so that just a little bit.
Okay, I was going to clarify that.
That's all right. But you're talking about your experience in college, and your college experience for me would have been high school, and but the dynamics are very much the same. I remember going to a high school where, in fact, integration was one of the things that was happening. There were very few black kids in my high school. I think there were something like 6 black males in my class, probably about 6 or 7 black females, and we were clearly outnumbered by the other students that were present. I remember being on a part of the city where, in fact, we had to worry about could we make it home from school each day because we had to take the bus.
Because of the neighborhood in which the high school was in?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. The high school was, I refer to it as kind of an Eastern European ghetto in terms of community and neighborhood, and we would have to pass through what I also thought of as a Spanish-speaking part of town, and then we would finally arrive to the community that I lived in, which at the time was undergoing racial transition. Mm-hmm. But the dynamics of racism were there every day.
Okay. Earlier, I think Rich, you mentioned helping the next generation with the lessons of getting through. Could each of you describe what you see as the lessons that black parents have to transfer or share with their children and grandchildren?
You have no control over how other people perceive you. And in one sense, you can never be held responsible for their attitudes about who you are and what you're capable of doing. And so, in one sense, you've always got to present yourself as a person of intelligence and of demeanor which says, I'm not a threat.
Okay.
Because in one sense, that's the image that I've perceived of the last 2 to 3 years, is that people of color have been seen and perceived as a threat and not as a co-equal in the human race.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I remember before coming to this community, living in the Washington, D.C. area and working with young boys, ages 10 to 13, and talking to them about the fact that they had to comport themselves in a particular way if they ever got stopped by the police, that they could not blow up, they could not show violence, they could not do the things that might naturally be a part of the human temperament, and ask, for example, why are you stopping me, in a manner that showed some anger, because the moment that they displayed anger, their lives were in danger. And they could face situations that could quickly escalate to a level of violence that no one would ever anticipate. I can't imagine in white America that you have to have the conversation that many black parents have with their children about, this is how you compose yourself if you ever get stopped. This is what you need to do in a situation if you get stopped in the car. How do you de-escalate? What do you need to do? How do you move your body in the presence of confrontation? But this is normal behavior, and this is part of what black parents have had to transmit to their children for ages.
Right. I remember my cousin who had two boys, two African American males, and telling them as they began driving, here's what you do if you get stopped by the police. All of these, rules of behavior,
right?
In order to do this. Now, as we were talking, we talked about these young people, but here you are, two professional black males, black clergy, respected in your community. Do you travel with that same fear? Do you have to travel with that same acute ears for what might happen if the police stop you?
Well, as I said maybe earlier, when we get stopped, if we're not in clerical garb, or even if we are, the first thing that we have to be aware of is that we may be perceived as threat anyway. The police don't necessarily know that we're doctors, that we're highly educated men, that we are in a sense pillars of the community that we live in. They don't know that. Often the first thing we have to do is comport ourselves so that they are not afraid of us, which I just, my sense is that doesn't happen to everyone in this country.
Right.
I think I wish we had been able to say very clearly that there had been some modification of behaviors coming out of the 60s, which said that how people are treated to one another was also a part of the change, rather than just adherence to laws. Because if the color of my skin is a perceptual guide to threat, then nothing has changed. Because that was the modus operandi during the 1800s, the 1860s, into the 1880s. And in one sense, that says very clearly that there's always kind of an attitudinal adjustment once a person encounters a black person. And I had an experience this past summer where a person described who they were, and I said, I can replicate everything you've talked about. I grew up in the church. I'm a Sunday school graduate. I was a youth person. I was an officer in Luther League in a statewide organization. I was on National Luther League Executive Board. I'm a college graduate from a Lutheran college. I'm a graduate from a Lutheran seminary. And I said, and what makes us different when we walk down the street? The reality is the color of my skin is the only dividing line between the two people.
Right. Right.
And there's always going to be a perceptive difference in the majority of society, not all.
Sure.
But in the majority of society about who I am and what I represent.
So, in a sense, when President Obama was first elected, and some people were talking about this post-racial attitude, or that racism has sort of lessened in these United States. And from what I hear, we still have the same issues, even with an African American president.
I would suggest that people really take seriously the conversations that have been made public from the second day of after his inauguration about what kind of term president he was going to be, or the comment that came from a congressman in the context of a State of the Union speech.
Yes.
There's always been an attitudinal adjustment which says that somehow either we are not truthful, we're not honest, we're not forthright, we are not equal with those who are others. And that is, it's a perceptive piece which then starts the congregation, not as a middle part or even an ending of the conversation. And unfortunately, it's not just in the governmental systems or in general society, it's also part of the church.
Right.
Well, there was also, and just to maybe continue along that line for a moment. There was this notion that because President Obama had been elected, that we now had arrived, that we
Right.
were in a post-racial society, and those who were older were indeed saying, be cautious. A black president doesn't mean that we've gotten rid of racism. It doesn't mean that the attitudes have changed throughout the country. And the way that he's had to deal with Congress, or the way that Congress has dealt with his election, is in fact in some measure an indicator that the problems of a divided racial climate are still with us. Would that we could say attitudes changed because this event took place. I think it would be a misnomer to say that some attitudes haven't changed, but in fact, the climate may be better in some ways, but in some ways, the denial of the effects of racism on our society have made things worse for a significant part of the population.
Okay, I'm going to push you a little bit more, or maybe focus in a little more on this subject, and that is, where do you see the church in addressing Black Lives Matter? Hasn't the church always been open to the other, or the gospel calls us to be open to the other? How has the church promoted or hindered the importance of Black lives and other peoples of color?
Historically, it's kind of interesting because the first Swedish missionary that came over to do missionary work among black and red heathen. Harvard College was started for the education of people to both serve and educate black and red heathen.
Right.
Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, when he got off the boat in Charleston, South Carolina, noted that the congregation, the people in the islands people in South Carolina were 5-1 black to white, and he wondered whether or not their souls had been saved. So in one sense, there's this gospel orientation about saying very clearly humanity needs to hear God's word and be a part of God's community. And yet at the same time, we have lived very, and I'm not certain I want to use this term, but gracefully in a society which does not recognize that centrality of the gospel. So that it is possible then to be a Christian and a slave owner. It is possible then for slave owners and pastors to open their churches up to freedmen.
Right.
It is possible for a slave-owning pastor to send a freedman north to be educated and ordained to be a pastor to Lutherans, preferably overseas. So there's this kind of an integrated process of saying, I want to live in this society and I want to give my life to this society, but I don't necessarily want to abridge the guidelines and the social norms of that society. And so we live in this kind of tension, and we've lived there for almost 300 years. Because in one of the oldest living congregations in the ELCA will celebrate its 350th anniversary this year. 1666 was the church in St. Thomas. And
in the U.S. Virgin Islands.
In the U.S. Virgin Islands. And this is still a congregation of the Lutheran Church, always has been, and is basically, for the most part, a historically black congregation. West Indians, but part of the ELCA. So we live in this really kind of funny tension.
There's also been the ambivalence, and I guess the best way to say is that on one hand there's been a statement of goodwill and good intent, and it's been gospel directed, and it is perhaps held up some notion of an inclusivity of vision. But then there's been the practicality that has happened as the church has conformed to the society around it. And so we get Daniel Alexander Payne, ordained, Lutheran, community served, ends up being another community because of the fact that this church body can't deal with the fact that he's of African descent. And and then there's the ambivalence, and we have been dealing with this ambivalence in the church forever. And so, are there black Lutherans? Yes. Has the church had goals about that? Yes. Have we met those goals? No. Why? Well, you get all sorts of excuses about that, why it's happened. We talked maybe earlier about the fact that the understanding of those goals and hermeneutics in Lutheran circles about law and gospel, and it seems to me we have people today who are saying, well, we should forget those goals because we can't achieve them. The Lutheran Church is 98% white. It's the whitest denomination among North American Protestants, and yet the gospel, at least as I read it, says that we see the kingdom of God as inclusive, and that the aim of that kingdom, based on grace, says that everyone belongs. What do we do?
Okay. Well, I can't believe our time is running out. We could go on and on. But what gives you hope, in the midst of all that we've just briefly touched on? We could go on for days. But what gives you hope in the midst of the whole issue of Black Lives Matter?
I guess I want to bridge into something that has been coming up a lot more on Facebook than Black Lives Matter within Lutheran circles, and that's decolonization.
Could you share what do you mean by decolonization for our listening audience?
I wish I could come up with a shorthand definition because I'm still questioning in lots of ways. Mm-hmm. One is I'm dealing with the history in which we were saying very much our colonization was to be an outreach to folks who were not a part of the Lutheran circle in terms of bloodlines.
Right.
But at the same time, we have maintained those affinities to communities that of origin. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we have not been able to spread out beyond those communities of origin in ways that have meaningful exposure and experience in the American context. And I guess the methodology that I perceive, one has to do with the way in which liturgy is done, the way in which we maintain traditions, and some other things which are very much a part of my own history and education and methodology. But at the same time, they're wanting to say very clearly, are there other ways in which we can reach the community that are not a part of our traditions? And how do we then take the core of our theology beyond the traditions and into a way in which we meet the needs of a community that is very much a part of the hurting community in this world and in this country, and say very clearly, the gospel that we're offering has something for you, and we want to share it with you in a meaningful kind of way in your current context, and not in whatever is perceived as a past context or historical context or even the context of the majority of the church.
Okay.
In some ways, listening to Rich, it sounds like the decolonization question is the age-old question that can go back as far as Paul and the early Christian community asking, does one need to be circumcised in order to become a Christian? Mm. Do you need to become a Jew before you can belong to this Judaic messianic movement of Jesus? And Paul's answer, of course, was no, it's unnecessary for you to be anything other than you are, besides confessing and acknowledging that Jesus is the Christ and be baptized. And so in some sense, what we are dealing with in decolonization is the question of, we would say indigenization, enculturation. Can the gospel take shape and form in a community that does not see its origins in the European continent? Can there be authentically American Lutherans of black descent? Can there be Africans and Asians and Polynesians, and you go on, you can go on and on.
Right.
But that question is the age-old question, and the resistances to the idea that one can authentically be who you are as a human being and
right.
belong to this community is still a question that we're grappling with.
Okay. Well, I can't believe our time is up, but I hope for our listening audience that this begins a conversation on the issue of Black Lives Matter in your various communities. Mm-hmm. My guests today have been Dr. Richard Stewart, who is retired Associate Professor of Church Administration and the Practice of Ministry at the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia, and Dr. Joseph Donnella, Chaplain of the College and Adjunct Professor of Religious Studies at Gettysburg College. For the Seminary Explorers, this is Nelson Strobert. Have a good day.
You have been listening to The Seminary Explorers from historic Seminary Ridge in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a production of Gettysburg Seminary. We invite you to visit our website at www.ltsg.edu. Opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of Gettysburg Seminary or the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America.